Okay, brilliant. Hi, everybody. My name is Claire Foster, and I'm the events coordinator here at Type Books. And I'm so happy to welcome you to the virtual launch of The Far Shore, in indie games, Superbrothers, and the making of Jett by Adam Hammond, which was recently published by Coach House Books. Today, Adam will be in conversation with his editor, David Barry, who's also the author of On Nostalgia, which was also published by Coach House Books in 2020. This event, I know, has many people tuning in from all over, but I want to let everyone know that Type Books is an independent bookstore in Toronto. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that Type Books, where we are selling this book, is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 and signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we encourage you to reflect on the history of the land from which you are listening and tuning in as well. Finally, I'll clarify that this is a webinar, which means that while you can see us, we cannot see you. So feel free to put in any questions you have in the Q&A bar, which is down below, or comment in the chat, and we will do our best to get to all of them before the end of the event. And shortly, I'll also insert links to buy the book in the chat as well. Adam Hammond is the author of Literature in the Digital Age, A Critical Introduction, and co-author of Modernism Keywords. His writing has appeared in The Walrus, the Literary Review of Canada, and the Globe and Mail, and his work has been profiled in Wired and on the BBC and CBC Radio. He is Associate Professor in the Department of English at the University of Toronto. And David Barry is an Edmonton-based writer, editor, and critic whose work has appeared in, among other places, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Walrus, and the CBC. His first book, On Nostalgia, was released by Coach House in 2020, as I previously mentioned. So Adam and David are going to be in conversation, and towards the end of the event, I will come back and communicate any questions you have. So just a reminder, you can put in the questions anytime during the event in the Q&A bar down below, and I will leave it to Adam and David. Thank you both so much and welcome.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. Yeah. Welcome everyone who I cannot see, but also welcome.
Apparently there are 50 people who we cannot see. So.
Oh, though wonderful. Okay, great. Well, I'm just going to pretend that it's just the two of us chatting, and we'll get through that. Yeah. Well, Adam, I I guess one of the things I kind of wanted to start with on the top was, I'm not sure, though hopefully people have this wonderful book in their hands, they might not know quite as much about the journey to get there, which in many ways was as long and arduous as the making of the game itself. Well, because you were chronicling it, of course. But so I was wondering if you could maybe just first sort of, just tell the story of how you came to write this book, and also, to scratch my curiosity itch, if you could maybe get into how did the book change for you over the course of, I believe it was 8 or 9 years, and did the final product kind of end up close to what you thought you were starting with?
Yeah, oh my God, I could probably talk for all 50 minutes about those things, because that was a really long time ago. 2013 is when I signed the contract for this. So I was 32, maybe 31. Now I'm 40. I barely recognized the young fellow who started this book. I didn't know if I was going to end up getting an academic job. I had just finished my PhD. It was a very bad time to get academic work, as it still is today. But at that time, the financial crisis had just happened. So I was kind of just trying to figure out what I might do with my future. And I heard about this Exploded Views series that Coach House was doing, which at the time, the way it was in this series, my book is no longer part of this series, but it was originally imagined as being part of the series. And what I heard about at the time was kind of going to be like a 33 1/3 type of a thing. which I'm a huge fan of that series. Short books, those are all about albums, but these would be like thin volumes, like 20,000 word books about something like Canadian contemporary culture. So I do have a bunch of props around me, and I don't know which ones I'm going to refer to, but this question allows me to talk about a couple of them. So before I even thought this would be a book about this game, my first idea was for it to be a book about the Canadian musician Destroyer, AKA Dan Behar. I wanted to write a book about his career because at the time I was obsessed with him. And a friend of mine hooked me up with his email address, and I wrote him this email being like, hey, I want to write a book about you maybe. Haven't pitched it yet, but I think it would be cool. And he wrote me one of the greatest emails I have ever received, which ended with him pleading with me not to write the book and saying that if I did, I would come to despise him because he would refuse to tell me anything about his life and we would just end up miserable. So it was, I loved that ending to that saga. I was also briefly considering writing a book about Greg Curneau, my favorite Canadian artist, who's from London, Ontario, like me, but he didn't quite fit the contemporary bill. But yeah, around this time I was teaching this class at the University of Toronto called The Digital Text, and I was teaching this game, Sworcery, that I was kind of obsessed with, and that seemed like the idea, like maybe write a book about Sworcery. And the timing worked out that I wrote to Craig. I only made a Twitter account so that I could get in touch with Craig Adams, aka Superbrothers, the maker of Sworcery, and I sent him a bunch of DMs, and eventually he saw them and responded to them. And he was interested. This is something that I think is actually one of the reasons that this book was possible to write, is that video game people, unlike say Dan Behar of Destroyer, are interested in the idea of like academic attention in their work. Like when I've met various people from the games world, they're actually like really curious and excited to know that someone's like thinking about their games and like teaching their games at U of T and this kind of stuff. So anyway, Craig turned out to be a really easy person to talk to. We got into some good, I think, textual conversations at first. And he was like, yeah, actually, you know what? Instead of writing about my last game, why don't you write about my next game? And why don't you come visit me in Quebec? And so if you get the book, you will see that this is where it begins. It's like, I don't really know what I'm getting myself into, but off I go in 2013, October, to visit Craig in the woods of Quebec in a location that I still cannot disclose. And yeah, and it all started from there. I had no idea what the book was going to be. Of course you can't, because I'm writing about this game that hadn't finished yet. So the whole time I have no idea what it's going to be. And then, so it's supposed to come out in 2015. Well, the game doesn't come out, so it keeps getting pushed back. And then my academic interests change and I get a actual professor job. And so, yeah, I mean, the way that it evolves from that point is just, I just kind of went with it. Like I had an idea for a book about DIY and tying all my like modernist literature to punk music to indie games. And then at a certain point I realized, you know what, I don't need to do the Superbrothers book and this other academic book. I can do a book that's really big that does all of those things, and I could probably do all of them better than I would have done them if they'd done them independently, and tell this long story. And yeah, so that's the long answer, is that I didn't have any idea what this book was going to be until like a couple months ago, right? Like as you know, because we started working on this together in like August, and even then it was like half of it was done. It came together in like a couple of months, and I still don't even really have a handle on what it is, because it was done so fast and then it's out, and yeah, I haven't been able to process it myself.
Judging only from like reading the tortures of, you know, spending 8+ years working on a video game, I do think there's something to be said for just like, here's a deadline, get it done, everyone, and figure it out later. But I might be biased on that one, for sure.
Oh, for sure. But one thing I can tell you out of your initial question, like, was it as torturous as making the game? Definitely not. I was doing other stuff. Like for me, it was like checking in, doing my thing, checking in. And it was, I think in the last couple months, it was probably more or less like I got to experience a slice of what it was like for them for much of that period. And, you know, in conversations with Craig and Patrick, since the book's been finished, so Craig Adams and Patrick McAllister, the two main people behind the game, along with Andy Rorman, who did the music, they've said, you know, I think you overstated how hard it was. It wasn't that bad, really. But I talked to them. I know what it was like. And I think they're, like, to some extent, misremembering how awful it seemed. Or maybe they just got so used to it. But they were working a lot harder for a lot longer. I still can't imagine what it's like to work non-stop on a game, a project for 8 years. Yeah, without a deadline also, without any firm sense of when it's going to finish up.
Well, it struck me thinking about this again, that essentially what happened to them, which was going from being a small, you know, independent, 2 or 3 of them working on this at a time, to turning into kind of like a AAA style game, you know, just with huge funding, a bunch of collaborators, a bunch of people, would be as if, you know, in the middle of this book, someone said, how about instead of a book, you write a 10-part HBO documentary on the making of Jett. And so, you know, I think the book gets into that really well. But I was just sort of curious, from your perspective, did you ever think that this was the path that they were going to go down? That what started as this very independent small thing would ever end up as, you know, launching the PlayStation kind of game?
Launching the PlayStation, definitely not. But they always thought of it as a PlayStation game, like from the very beginning. And they always thought that there would be a point at which they would probably have to bring in a publisher. That was always part of the plan. I think the kind of details of exactly what would get done before the handover, they didn't quite get that. The experience of Sworcery was always involved in indie studio, Capybara Games, and it went not smoothly. It was super hectic, but I think the kind of like the team was always pretty clear who was going to be doing what. So I do remember in 2013 when I met Craig, he was already hoping it would be a PlayStation game, imagining it as a PlayStation game, and thinking about who the publishers might be. But the extent of like ramping up, they might have known it was going to happen, but they didn't know what it would be like. And I think, I mean, that's the main narrative. Like that's what happened to the game. What happened to the game is two people, really, Craig and Patrick, working incessantly for years, just the two of them, looping in Andy to do the music every now and then, but really the two of them, and always kind of waiting for, okay, when do we hand it over? When have we done enough to get to the next step, and not knowing when it would come. And then when it did come, just not knowing how to do that, like not knowing how to be the types of like businessmen, managers, to work with a huge team and all these personalities. And yeah, I mean, it's the HBO analogy is a great one, because imagine, yeah, it's your passion project. It's almost like you're writing a script, like, you know, it's going to be a TV show the whole time, but it's your thing that you have total control over. And then not only do you hand it over to a production team at HBO who know what they're doing, you actually have to build the production team yourself and manage it. And you've never done that before. And so, yeah, it was, one of the things like that I always, like one of my big lessons from all of this is that I could never make a video game. Like, not that I was ever really thinking about it,
right?
But I could never do it. And I don't think very many people have the skill set to be able to lead something like this. The fact that it got finished at all is an enormous triumph for those two people. It's just given the level of complexity involved in doing something like this.
Well, you know, that's a good, I often think of, you know, really good artist biographies as the ones that sort of prove to you just how unique, like, you could never be Bob Dylan or something like that. You could just, that kind of remove that wonderful fantasy that we all sometimes have of like, well, but it's like I could have been a whatever, and it just shows you what it actually takes to do something like that. So I mean, credit there to you for revealing that. But
yeah, they have a kind of like tenacity, and it's not just like, the idea that like being a successful artist, that so much of it is just showing up and doing the work. I remember something in Proust, I think, where like that's a book where like a lot of obvious things are said that you're like, I didn't need a 1.5 million word book to teach me this, but like there'll be these real insights. And one of them is Proust knew, because he was like a socialite for the first part of his life, and eventually he found a way to just lock himself into that cork-lined room and just write all day. That you just need to do it. And both of them are really good at just working steadily, getting her done. It's not glamorous, but I think it's harder and less glamorous even than what Proust put himself through.
I can't see the faces of anyone who was coming here hoping to learn how to be a game developer and is just sinking now under the realization that they'll never do it. But,
at least this type of game, like,
yeah,
you can make like a little sketch game. Like, I got an email from Patrick yesterday morning, which I still haven't replied to. If you're out there, Patrick, he said that he made this like just like a game jam type of game over the holidays, which must have been so satisfying for him after this huge project that takes literally a decade, to go back to making these kind of little fun one-off games that you could actually make in a weekend type of thing. The big ones for the consoles, just on a scale, it's unbelievable. So much harder than making a film.
Yeah. Well, as unique as the challenges, I guess, of a video game are, I think some of the tensions we were talking about before about, I suppose, moving from that kind of DIY indie, personal space into that bigger thing is, as you say, it's kind of the spine of the book, and maybe it's a little more of a familiar narrative to people. But the case you sketch for, I think, DIY as kind of an identifiable movement that keeps popping up through these different artistic things, whether it's modernist literature, punk music, zines, and now kind of indie games, where you jump in, is really interesting and compelling. And one of the things I really wanted to ask you, despite having edited the book, I guess it never came up, was just, to what degree is I guess a DIY ethic almost inevitable in an art movement, or in a period? Is it inevitable in the way art develops that you'll sort of get this kind of ethic that grows up, and then is it then also inevitable that all the people who indulge in this will kind of sell out or die, kind of thing?
Yeah, because it's impossible. It's an impossible ideal, right? Yeah, if you can't sell stuff and you can't have an audience, then there is no such thing as success. Success is failure, or it's just some kind of thing. You have to be dead to be pure enough to actually, it's impossible. I think one of the things that interested me about this is how it's not inevitable, like the DIY ethic, and how, especially in modernism, the t-shirt that I'm wearing is a Blast t-shirt. This is one of the other props I wanted to show off. Blast is this gigantic and beautiful magazine. This is a reprint of it, Modernist magazine from 1914. This is, I do have an original, though it's too fragile to pull on screen. It's one of the reasons that I'm happy that the book has a bunch of pink on it, because Blast is associated with this color. Blast is a great example of something that was kind of made in a DIY manner, but there's nothing in there about how that's how you should be making art. It's kind of implicit that you can only do this kind of stuff if you're operating outside the mainstream, or to some extent opposing yourself to it. But there's no, like, the manifesto doesn't say you need to do it yourself or it doesn't count. And in punk, like, those things go so hand in hand. And yeah, so like, I was born in 1981. I grew up in the 90s. And I think my like punk ethic sort of shows you the limitations of the DIY ethic, because I was like a middle-class kid growing up in London, Ontario. My first band that I was in has the worst band name of all time that I think it encapsulates the kind of middle classness of the DIY ethic in some way. We were called YUP, which stood for Youth Underprivileged. And we were all like middle class kids. You got to have like some kind of resources to be able to hold the DIY ethic, have that purity, right? You have to have some kind of source of income to allow you to be so pure. But the DIY ethic that grew up around punk, looking back at modernism, it fits so well, but I just didn't see it very often, which was interesting to me. Like the only place that I ever found it really clearly articulated is in Virginia Woolf, who's just like, she's there to say every idea, and she's the right person to pick to write my dissertation about, because she's just incredible on every topic. But in Three Guineas, she talks about it. And this is quite a bit of the book is devoted to her running her own press and being able to sort of say what she wanted to say because she did it herself. But yeah, punk was so attached to that ethos and still is. But modernism had the kind of like the style, but it wasn't so, it was only really could have happened because of that DIY practice, but it didn't have the kind of the ethos. And I think like in the world of indie games, it's never really worked in as pure a way as it could have in punk. Like you really need help and you need money and investment because they're so hard to make. And there are like really indie versions of like, say, digital interactive entertainment, like Twine games are one of the things I talk about in the book, which you can really make, anyone could make one in an hour and distribute it for nothing. But in what was called indie games, like in the indie game documentary, it never quite fit. And I think like one of the things that I hope just comes across as a tension throughout the book is how I'm really like attracted to the idea of the DIY ethic, and I want the game to fit it, while also realizing that it's impossible for it to do so. And also getting that the creators are quite frustrated that I keep trying to place them into that position, while also being attracted to it. Like that's one thing I always found with Craig and Patrick and Andy, is that they wanted to be DIY, but realized that they couldn't and were frustrated that they couldn't, and also frustrated that they were expected to. So it is one of those books where like my thesis, like I think it's compelling, but I don't want to just prove it. Like I want to constantly be testing it and seeing where it breaks down. And I tried to have this kind of like loose moving structure through the book, where it's like structured through a series of, oh, that's why it doesn't work, or that's why I want it to work, and it might be something like this, but not quite. So for me, like a big, like one of my favorite parts of the book is where Andy Werman, the musician, scientific, kind of like sits me down and he's like, okay, here's what you want from us. And I really am attracted to that too, because he grew up in like the 90s DIY scene, like this scene out of Olympia, Washington, which I think is like, of all the punk movements, is the like the purest, most interesting articulation, the most commitment to the DIY. I think that produced like the best DIY music, I would say anyway. He's like, I feel it, I was there, but it's not quite what you think it was. And it doesn't work when we're making this game. It's just a beautiful moment that just like ties so many of my threads together, and that ends a section of the book. And yeah, for me, it's kind of like, okay, well done, Andy. You did it. You showed me how complex it is. On to the next thing.
Yeah. So diving a little more into that complexity, one of my favorite, speaking of sections of the book that explain things, is I believe it's when Craig is just before he's actually started to tell you about Jett the game, and he kind of explains that, one of the things that's driving him is that a lot of the reaction to Sword and Sworcery, which You know, I think like many people, I had the same reaction you did, this like beautiful, wonderful game, but it did get kind of dinged as pretentious and, you know, it's an arty, you know, indie game, whatever. And then Craig's response to that is to dive straight into like, you know, futurist, Russian inspired, you know, eco fable, like just, he can't help, I think, maybe, but make a game that is maybe a little pretentious, or just that has these
I thought that's
you know,
where you're
just,
going. Yeah.
like it's just so baked into him, I think. And so I guess part of what I was wondering is like, did you ever like did you ever get the sense that this, you know, like he could just step back and go make, you know, Doom 2020 or something like that, or is there something kind of inevitable about, even if he rejects, nominally rejects this idea of being a DIY or something artist, that it just, you know, his approach and his ethos and his ideas are inevitably going to kind of lead him down this sort of path?
Yeah, no, he's an artist. That's the thing that attracted to me to this project. That's another kind of like dramatic moment for me, like in real life and also in the book, is like I go to Quebec, I meet this person whose game I think is incredible and I'm deeply attached to, and then he's like, I don't want to do anything like that again. I don't want to do pixels, which is, I thought that was a very beautiful game. I get that the style was starting to get played out, so good for him. Like that's like, speaking of people like Bob Dylan, like real artists are always reinventing themselves. So it's definitely like a healthy thing. But no pixels, no irony, no like hipster language, no pretentiousness, I think on some level too. And like the way, one of the things that if you read the book, you might be like, this doesn't seem like it could actually have happened. It's all too like perfectly sequenced, but it all literally happened exactly the way I said it did. The events, like I didn't invent anything. It really happened. So like, it's like the end of the day where he told me all this stuff, and it's like, tomorrow we will talk about the next game. So I spent the whole night like worrying about, well, what's this next game going to be? Because if it doesn't have any of the things that I like about it, I'm probably going to hate it. I remember I had a bunch of weird nightmares that night, all of which I wrote down in my journal because it was right next to me. One I remember best is I imagined a three-dimensional landscape, which turned out to be true. And I didn't know, I don't think when I went to sleep, that it was going to be a 3D game with shapes that I described as being like upside down Reese's Pieces, which if you look in the game, a lot of the trees look like upside down Reese's Pieces, and the goak bloom, which are like the key thing, the key most important plant in the game, look like upside down Reese's Pieces, I think so. I had a prophetic dream. But anyway, yeah, I woke up the next day and I was delighted to learn that his next idea was like even more absurdly grand than the previous one. Like, I think honestly, like the highlight of the whole project for me was the day where he walked me through the whole next project, because he had been so stressed with Sworcery. It was really hard to bring that to completion. There's a video you can watch on Vimeo, which is filmed by Wiley Wiggins, who's the guy in Dazed and Confused, who's always going like, oh man. That guy got into indie games and was part of the Austin indie game scene. And he, with his iPhone, recorded this talk that Craig gave, where he hadn't slept, I think in like possibly 3 days, maybe 4 days. And you can just see he's so worn down. He's gone from this period of intense activity to actually getting some time to reflect and recharge after all of the Sworcery madness played out. And I've met him just as like he's collected all of the ideas, had a chance to really think, read a bunch of books, and the vision has just come together. And it's just incredible how like fully imagined it was. And it's also a shame that you can't just take the vision and just put it into the computer and it's a game, because the next 8 years was like taking that and making it happen. And one of the things to me that's kind of amazing is how little it actually changed, like how close the conception in 2013 was to the thing that was actually released as Jett. Yes, there were lots of like twists and turns, but fundamentally it's the thing that they set out to make, which is absurdly grandiose. It's not just Doom, and God bless them for it, because they swung for the fences on this one.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of that, and I mean, I don't necessarily want to get too much into judging the game. Let's let people do that on their own. But one of the things that really fascinated me, especially about that early part, was you know, this realization that Craig was somebody who was kind of pursuing an agenda, or just, you know, at least had like set out this weird life path, you know, from the time he was kind of 18 or 19 to be, I think, you know, an artistic propagandist is kind of the phrase there. And, you know, I don't know how much he you know, how much he set out to do that, and at a certain point, you know, maybe he didn't care about that at all, and it was just like, let's get this game out. But I am curious from your perspective, sort of like, you know, how much of that do you see? How successful do you think it was? And then maybe in a more general sense, like, how good is art, whether it's video games or whatever, at propaganda? Like, what do you think of this goal to try to make art that that speaks to people in this way?
Just a small question.
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I like, again, part of my interest in the modernist project, like modernist literature, writers in the early 20th century, these kind of avant-garde writers and artists, they felt like they did have a project to transform the world, and not necessarily just by telling you what to do, but like creating new forms of art that could lead to new ways of thinking. So not like think this, but more like think this way. And like, you know, one of the most appealing is the idea that they kind of like shock you into an active consciousness. And, you know, there's tons of terrible art from the period. And a lot of it is the stuff that just is blandly propagandistic. But I love the idea that like artists believe that they can have world-changing consequences from what they do. And that's another thing that draws me to this DIY thing, is because like when artists feel like I have full control over this medium, I can do it exactly the way I want, it tends to be when artists are the most ambitious. You know, and in the modernist period, literature is the dominant popular form. So it makes sense that you would be able to change the way everyone thinks by writing in new ways. And in the 70s, with music as an immensely influential popular form, it makes sense to think new ways of making and recording and distributing music will maybe really change the world. And it's really hard to measure whether they did or not. It's easy to like, oh, nothing changed. But like, we are the products of that period. I don't know, like if it's 2% or 98% of like what the Sex Pistols did determined who I am, I don't know. But of course, like video games, dominant popular form of today. Like, yeah, get in there and do something. And that is exactly what appealed to me about Superbrothers, especially from the beginning, is like those manifestos. They sounded like modernist manifestos. And it also appealed to me that something like Sworcery, like it does not have an obvious propagandistic message. It's not telling you like, do this, but it does try to get you into like states of mind or ways of thinking in the cleverest ways that are doing just that, kind of like what modernists did, do formal experimentation. So when I heard that Craig like had this path for himself, which I only learned when I met him in real life, I was so excited because I thought that was like, I felt like I had imagined that that's what he was up to, but it couldn't possibly be actually what he was up to, but it turned out he was. And I was very excited by that. And I think like, yeah, the idea that this was the one, like, okay, we've built up our cultural capital and our financial capital. We've got the war chest, we've got the cred. We're going to put all the chips in on this next game, and it's going to be the one that like, that, you know, turns the dial on the environment, I think is the term that he used at one point. I thought that was awesome. And I was really excited, but especially because the way they were imagining that at first is it's like a game that models interactions with the environment. Like what you do in the game is like you learn to attend to the world, and by being respectful to the world and the creatures that live in the world, you probably like, you just have to learn how to attend to the world to beat the game. And maybe you take that back into the real world and you attend differently to the environment and the people that you talk to. It's like an empathetic thing that it models. Maybe the game didn't fully get all of that, but I can tell you that when the game started, that was exactly what united Patrick and Craig, is this desire to like model a different way of relating to the world. And if they are frustrated with the game at the end, and I still think when I talked to them, they weren't ready to have any kind of perspective on it. So you get these like quite negative views that they have of their own game at the end. But if they were frustrated, it's that it was hard to make a game that was about attending to the environment and also told a story and also was a game and also like would, you know, give you thrills on the PS5. It's a lot of things to do all at once. But yeah, I think that the real life and like energy that the game has, the engine of that is this big, ambitious, world-changing project. I think without that, it's just like another exercise in like, we're gonna get rich. And yeah, it just plain was not motivated by that.
Is there something, and this is where, you know, I kind of had to, well, it's revealed in the book, but in case you haven't read it yet, you're not really a gamer. You're more like an interested in the theory of video games maybe than the games themselves. But I am sort of curious from that perspective, is there something, you know, unique about video games and how interactive they are that makes a goal like this, yeah, but changing how people think, more accessible or easier or anything like that, as opposed to say like a novel or a Wagnerian opera or something, when it comes to trying to change that point of view? Or is it just a matter of like, well, these are the popular art forms, and therefore people are going to sort of be attuned to them and maybe more sensitive to what they're trying to do, regardless of how they're actually
I think for sure, like if I was such an artist, like someone who wanted to be a major artist, who really like shaped a generation, which I am, like, I'm the guy who wrote the book about the game. So that tells you that I am already not nearly at that level of ambition. But if I was such an artist, I would be making video games for sure, mostly because of the audience, the kind of engagement. There's like no sense of, there's no like eating your greens sense that audiences come to games with, like, oh, I have to respect this, it's a classic. It's like you play them out of a desire to like fully immerse yourself. And I do also think there's something about the form of a well-executed game, and it is like the way that Wagner theorized opera, or like McLuhan talked about television, as like a total environment where you can be sucked into a game and it can like demand your full sensory engagement in a way that I don't think any other art form can right now. And that might be to do with its novelty, because it doesn't feel hackneyed, and it doesn't feel like it has a history. It feels like you're right on the edge of what it's becoming. I think there's something about like watching an art form become while experiencing it. But yeah, I've like, although I am for sure not a gamer, which I think was a real advantage for writing this book, because I got to kind of stand outside of it and look from a different vantage point. But the few times that games have really engaged me, it's hit me like all the harder. Like I have no tolerance built up, and I can get like just totally engrossed and forget where I am completely. And I do feel like there's something about the newness of games, at least for me, that I can feel the way I'm engaging with the world changing. Like I had this experience this summer where when I finally got my copy of the game, partly because I was writing a book about it, I had to basically spend all day playing it for about a week. But I went out for lunch with some friends of mine in a park near my house. We were just sitting in this park, and there's this huge willow tree in the background. And there was something about like it, I felt like I was in the world of Jett for a second. And I was like paying attention to the trees and really looking at them and watching like the wind in the trees in a way that I know I don't normally pay attention to trees like that. Or like when I was playing Sworcery, like I was always thinking about the moon phase because that's really important. So like, I don't know if it changed me, like it tried to do this to me and it worked, but I was experiencing the natural world differently for that week. I remember in high school, I broke my collarbone when I was snowboarding, and I was stuck in my house recovering for like 2 weeks. And one of the things that's always been hard for me about video games is I feel like I'm wasting my time when I'm playing them. Like I should be doing something else, which is part of my like being a good boy thing or something. But I had nothing to do that week, so I just played TIE Fighter and Diablo straight for like a week, and I'd be going to sleep. And in this like half asleep state, I would be in the game, and it terrified me the way that it could sort of blur my sense of what was real or what wasn't. But I think that speaks to the power of the form. At the same time, I feel like games are so hard to do well, like immensely powerful, but so many things pushing against one another. It has to be a good story. For me anyway, I really need story games. Art has to be good, the music has to be good, there needs to be like a game, the game needs to fit the story, and like that's the story of Jett. Getting all those things working together is just incredibly, incredibly hard. Yeah, but when it works, it is truly magical.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think one of the, again, my favorite little parts in the thing was the, revelation that something like BioShock is which was, the biggest game of the year for a long time. Or the year it came out and was this paragon of I guess, like an artistic game. It really is a paper thin conceit where, ultimately the message it's trying to provide isn't lived out in the game. There's a disconnect between form and function, I guess, or between what you're actually doing and what you're, what it's trying to tell you. And so to see, I guess, Craig, like, call that out and then spend 8 years trying to find a way to, it's just like, oh, well, maybe that's why they didn't bother to, actually make you live out a libertarian hellscape, because it's way easier to just, go shoot some people.
I feel bad about BioShock because it ended up being kind of like the example of the bad game again and again. And it's honestly, I'm not the right person to comment on it because I'm just not the right player and I never got engaged with it. But yeah, Craig said awesome stuff about BioShock, and it was always like a real, I think it's, if nothing else, and I'm sure it has like real merits on its own, it's a great example of a game that people can react to and talk about. And he always like framed his interventions really well against BioShock. But yeah, again, like it's so cool that these problems have not been solved adequately yet. That the form is still so young and there is so much work to be done. And you can be like, okay, I am going to bring narrative and gameplay together in a new way. I'm going to make narrative and gameplay one and the same. One of the things that Craig said to me early on. It's such an incredibly cool artistic task to take on, and you can do it for 8 years and not succeed. But like how hard it is shows what a valid and important task it is. Yeah.
Well, I feel like that might be a good time. Oh, hey, and there she is to switch over to questions from the faceless anonymous crowd. Nothing against any of you. I'm sure you're all wonderful people. I just literally you're black bar on the top of my screen. So I assume you're out there though. So
there still appear to be 50-ish people hanging around. So thank you.
Yeah, and really engaged people too. We have a lot of questions, so I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but I'll kick it off in chronological order because they're all really good and very detailed. So let's go. We have a question for Adam that says, do you think that games such as Jett the First Shore are a window into what literature might look like in the future, in the sense of being more interactive than reading traditionally has been, with the reader having a role in defining how the story unfolds?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of what, like, games help us see what literature, like what do you mean by literature is one of the questions that I think games help us clarify. Like, what is a game and what is literature, and would literature become a game? Makes you be like, well, could literature become a game? What is our definition of literature by which it could even turn into such a thing? So I think like games, I think, help me see how just a nice formed, distinct thing like literary fiction is, for instance, as like words on a page. They do a thing, they do it well. There are still like lots to be discovered, but it's a thing and it's different. And even like the notion that it's not interactive, I think games help us see, no, actually reading is an incredibly interactive process and give us a way of sort of comparing, like changing the narrative. Is that something that I want? Is that a form of interactivity that I like? Or is the form of interactivity that I like or that I want, like just being given some space to imagine the consequences, or to like think through what I might do and then see what someone else chose and then have a space opened up to like reflect, oh, like that was a terrible decision. And if I were to do something like that, I would definitely want to do this. Like, they're just interactive in really different ways. I think one of the things that like interactivity can be such a frustrating experience. It can be so you realize you don't want the ability to impact narrative sometimes. Like there's more for you to do if someone else sets the story, and then you can kind of have this space to respond to it on your own terms. And I think like initially this game was going to be so interactive, the kind of early versions of it was going to be very open world, that it wouldn't really have had a narrative. It would have just been like a sandbox to go and do stuff. And like you might have had your adventures and like living a little second life, but it wouldn't really be a narrative. It ended up really focusing more on, it's a set, fairly linear narrative. There's really not much you can do. There are like tasks to go off and complete, and yeah, you can fail at them. But that kind of balance, I think that's the key thing. It's like every game is going to be different, but for game designers, like knowing how much freedom to give the reader, player, so that they're like satisfied. I think when you can have choice, then you want it. And with a book, it's like, well, I know I can't literally set the plot, so like I don't expect to. But that's just like another burden that makes this game designing so hard, is you set how much. So anyway, I think like books will continue to be books. Maybe some of like what we expect from literature will be, or already is, transferred out to all kinds of other genres like film and video games. I think for sure one thing is like part of what the word literature means just means that it's good, or people think it's good. And I think like that literature status is coming to games, and it's just inevitable that there will, there are lots, the game studies is quite a mature field now. There's a developing canon of like, these are the great games that we study. And yeah, that's happening and will continue to happen.
Great. There's another question. Is there a different type of gamer that appreciates the DIY aesthetic as a standalone quality / genre of video games, similar to how punk listeners appreciate the DIY in that genre? And if so, is this a new / emerging phenomenon?
Yes, for sure. I think one of the things that's so interesting about games is the fragmentation of the game playing public is still happening. So like what gave modernism its power in like the early 20th century is that there were all these newly literate people coming out of the 20th century. And everyone tended to think of like, oh, readers are like one mass. So we didn't have like, oh, there's like the readers of like this genre of like body horror, or one area of them, and then there's like poetry readers over here. It's like you just tended to think of like a big mass, so that if you're doing something really like wild, you might piss off everybody because they're actually paying attention. Whereas now in the literary world, it's so fragmented that like people in the poetry world aren't being noticed by people over here. They're just sticking to their own little tiny part of the sphere. And as a result, it's harder to like really make a splash and cross over. And I think like a lot of the reason that modernists did something is because they could get the attention of a huge number of readers and like anger them. Same with like punk, you know, like it had to be big, it had to get like a huge response from like all music listeners, and that's how it did its thing. So the same with gaming world, like something like Zoe Quinn's game Depression Quest, which is like a hypertext choice-based narrative about depression, ends up causing this gigantic furor because like all gamers are like, that's not a game. The idea that like there is a game and gamers get to decide what a game is just like totally alien to the world of fiction right now. Like, yeah, sure, whatever, do what you want over there. I'm not going to pay attention to it. I don't care. It doesn't impact me. But I think that's one of the reasons that games are in like a really interesting, if also extraordinarily like dangerous phase, is because you do something in the avant-garde world and a ton of people notice it and also get like, you know, act in this like completely reprehensible way using the digital tools at their disposal to make people's lives a living hell. But there's also power in this moment before the fragmentation. So for sure, yes, I think as we go forward, it'll be more like, oh, I'm into this type of game. I don't even pay attention to those mainstream games. But I think Jett still like, I think if Jett had only been marketed towards like the like gaming aesthete hipsters, it would have been like 100, all reviews would have been 100. Like all the frustrating things about it would have been like awesome, intentional, brilliant. But because it was marketed towards all gamers, get a lot of reviews like, well, the controls, like the performance wasn't where I wanted it. But like the SD gamers don't care about performance. They want like, they like the roughness of bad performance, you know? So it's like, it's judged by everyone. So if you go on Metacritic and you see a score of like 68 or whatever, that's not the aesthetes saying that it's a 68. That's everyone. And imagine like your literary fiction novel is reviewed by everyone, and that determines whether it's successful or not. It's a bizarre situation with power and with, you know, it's also like deeply uncomfortable.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Given that the academic study of games is becoming increasingly accepted and facilitated in departments of literature, as you have just spoken about, but it goes in a different way. I wonder how the enormous process of assembly and the variety of contributors affects our reading of games. As someone who has worked in the gaming industry as a localization tester, I feel I had an impact on the titles I worked on that is both crucial and absolutely insignificant. I guess I'm wondering what happens to the author figure when we read games instead of novels. Can we just forget about the author because they're dead in the first place? Is the DIY ethic providing a handle on indie titles that is different from AAA titles produced by multinational companies?
Yeah. The idea of like the author as a handle is great. And I think like if you look at something like film, like one of the reasons that figures like Jean-Luc Godard are so like attractive is because it's like, oh, this idea that he's the auteur, so he like controlled everything. On the one hand, it's like, oh, cool, he controlled everything. But on the other thing is like, oh, that makes it so easy to talk about now. Because if we just assume that he did everything, then we can talk about it like anything else, like a book, and just attribute it to one person. But of course, like that's a fiction with films. It's a fiction with books too, as me and my editor can confirm. There are lots of people who are working together and like all these different forces acting on you, not just individuals. So yeah, like part of the appeal of indie games, I think, has been that it takes an impossible to visualize process of many, many people working together in relationships that are too complex to simplify to like oh, it ended up like this because of this person. It simplified it into, oh, if it's just one person making it, then you can say it's Jonathan Blow who made this game. Awesome. Let's look at him and ask him questions and we'll understand it. So yeah, I think part of the appeal of indie games is just that it makes them easier to talk about in familiar ways. And so you can like bring in like hackneyed old narratives like The Genius. And for sure, I'm also like, I can expose the fallaciousness of this, but also be drawn into it because I like being able to be like, oh, cool, a person made this and they were like struggling in this way. And yeah, it fits into all these narratives. And that was part of the appeal of writing this book that's really about two people and a third. We're a three-person team. And it got a lot more complicated once all these other people got involved. And I couldn't talk to all of them for my own like research process. I talked to a bunch of people involved in it, but there were way more people involved than I managed to talk to and get into the book just because it became too much to manage. So yeah, how to even talk about games honestly in terms of like the individuals who created them, it is next to impossible.
Fantastic. Okay, I have one more question that I also think we're going to miss a few, but I think this question is a good one to end on for reasons other than the fact that it also relates to, I'm going to make us a minute or two late, but I think that relates to the question too, so we can draw a poetics there. Okay, so this question says, for all the challenges that the game's prolonged development posed to your writing of the book, were there any perhaps unexpected advantages for the book that resulted from the extended timeline?
Oh yeah. If I had written the book in 2015, it would have been a 20,000 word book about, I don't know, who knows, but it probably would have been like, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then they did that. I got to like expand the scope of this thing. It's a pretty long book now. It's not, how many words is it? I don't even remember, but it's a lot more than, it's like 70,000 words or something like that. It's a lot bigger. And yeah, all the stuff that happened to me and all the stuff I learned and all these like ideas that I had about it, it would have been a very unsatisfying book. And it was like really exciting to me to have no idea where I was going to end up, and then to end up with something that I absolutely could never have predicted in 2013, or honestly, even like a year ago, it would have been impossible to know where this thing went. So yeah, I mean, partly it was like, oh, the game's not out, sweet, I don't have to write it. I can do something else this summer. Oh, the game's still not out, okay, I can do something else. But yeah, I'm a big believer in like letting ideas simmer. Sometimes you don't know what you really want to say until you've really like slept on it for like a couple of years. And in this case, it took me a long time to figure out even what I wanted to say. So it wouldn't have been the same thing if it hadn't taken 8 years to simmer. I have one more prop I wanted to show before we go, which is I wanted to, just in terms of like things being a lot of work, these are just the notes that I made this summer. These are like transcripts of interviews, outlines. This is an outline here. This is a summary of an interview with Patrick that I've highlighted. I have like another, an entire file cabinet that's probably about 6 feet long of files in my office that I couldn't bring, but it was not as much work for me as for them, but just like that's August, September, and October.
That's amazing. David, do you have any last words?
Any last words? That's oh God, I should have prepared something. No, no. I just.
You can say no. I mean, I think we ended up at a great place.
Yes, that's such a poetic ending, and now it's like throwing to me. It's like a deer in the headlights. It's like I don't have that many notes on this book. I don't have any props either. So
I have so many more.
Yeah.
I want to close just by thanking all the people who helped me, and all how patient they were, like Craig and Patrick for letting a total stranger, just amazing. And then just talking to me, even when I was just being like really dense and making them explain things that it was very painful for them to explain. Alana at Coach House, like this book should have been killed like 5 years ago, kept getting put on catalogs and taking off, but she was just so patient. Yeah, and David for like coming in and taking parts of this book were a total mess. I'm so happy that you can't see the way that they look before David got his hands on them and shaping it into something. It was so thrilling because I love it when I'm very impatient. Once I'm working, I was like, I want it to be done. And it was just insane how quickly it all came together. And yeah, now it's out there in the world. So thank you to all those people.
Thank you so much. And yes, in the world, at Type Books, we have it at our Queen Street store. We are open. We have a limited capacity, but we're open for browsing. I've also just reinserted the links to buy the book on our website. So you can go there. And thank you so much. Thanks to everyone in the audience. And also just thank you to the two of you. I'm full of gratitude and I'm really happy to have been able to launch this book with you guys today.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Type. And thank you so much to everyone who came.
Thank you so much. Take care. Have a good night.